Good morning.
Morning.
We are discussing the many faces of wisdom in today's adult Sunday school class for June the 7th. So, during commencement exercises at high schools and colleges this time of year, you have some great speaker that's giving the graduating students some quote advice on the future. And then one speaker winds up his statements by saying, "And remember, graduates, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." Well, that probably wouldn't sit right with the secular group, but it is true, as we will find out as we go through this lesson today. In the book of Proverbs, Solomon had beyond 3,000 proverbs, wise sayings. Some of those were controversial and contradict each other. Example, haste makes waste, but he who hesitates is lost. So how can these two statements survive? We'll look into that too. The wisdom of each saying in this situation is situational. It depends on what's going on at the time and the environment. Biblical proverbs are as well controversial, but they are godly advice based on crucial premise, which we have mentioned earlier. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. We want to keep this premise in mind and helps a wise person discern when a certain course of conventional wisdom might not be exactly what needs to be done to obey God's law. Knowing God yields the wisdom to decide. So what's wisdom? Well, Wikipedia, the Dictionary of All, states that the wisdom is the ability to think and act using knowledge, experience, understanding, common sense, and insight. Wisdom is associated with attributes such as unbiased judgment, compassion, experiential self-learning, self-transcendence, non-attachment, and virtues such as ethics and benevolence. Pretty lengthy definition of wisdom. So that is Webster's definition. Let's look into the Christian definition. In Christian theology, wisdom describes an aspect of God or the theological concept regarding the wisdom of God. The Hebrew Bible, wisdom is represented by Solomon, who asked God for wisdom, and he was granted that. But the problem with Solomon, as we'll see in today's lesson, he didn't remain wise. He did not follow his teaching. Wisdom calls aloud in the streets, and in this case, it's mentioned that she raises her voice in the marketplace. We'll talk about that too. So, wisdom is ability to think and act using knowledge, understanding, and above all, common sense. Common sense is a missing element in today's society, I think, because we just can't think wisely in particular issues, no matter what they might be. Like any spiritual gift, wisdom has to be accepted and practiced regularly. Though he was a wise man, the direction Solomon's life took shows how he himself ignored the very words which he desired to be put forward to guide others. How do you gain wisdom? Well, in the second verse of the first chapter of Proverbs, it says, for gaining wisdom and instruction. What does that mean? Gaining wisdom is recognize the best course of action for a given situation and following through on that action to get a positive outcome. Instruction is correcting someone who has made a mistake. For understanding words of insight must become more than just theory or good advice. They must be personally embraced and applied in the order of genuine value. Otherwise, they are not really perceived. Another statement in our supportive text, clearly the biblical wisdom is to be demonstrated in practical ways, more than in one's academic prowess. Formal education has no bearing on whether a person can obtain wisdom. Moreover, Solomon's call for the readers to learn the virtue of righteousness, justice, and fairness resonates in the cultures all around the world, regardless of religious beliefs or educational background. Godly wisdom will help a young person navigate a sin-infested world by learning to choose what is right and what is wrong, or what is acceptable in God's sight. In the context of this passage, introducing the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and introducing that in the context of this passage, it means primarily to acknowledge and submit to the Lord as a source of true knowledge and wisdom. If one is not grounded, if we're not grounded in the understanding of the premise of this statement, the knowledge and wisdom will remain foreign to that person. As long as an individual possesses the fear of the Lord, he or she is on the right path to wisdom. And wisdom, it does not have an end result. Wisdom is a collective, ongoing process that must be nurtured and practiced throughout your lifetime. Wisdom comes from many places. It is thought that especially it comes from the minds of people who have spent their lives thinking. You can bring to mind those people we're talking about. Yet the rejection of the fear of the Lord as a basis for knowledge and of God, who is the source of wisdom and knowledge, is precisely the cause of the strife and turmoil and disorder that marks our current society. We need to think about that continually. Where does one begin in explaining the source and principles that can lead to a successful life? excuse me. If you are wondering where to begin, start with the fear of God. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Shouldn't ignore that, and we shouldn't forget that. To ignore wisdom is to embark on the path of fools. Let me say that again. To ignore wisdom is to embark on the path of fools. Such individuals demonstrate their contempt for God and His instruction. In human instruction, the consequences of not hearing or not listening to the teachings of our parents, mother, father, will be discipline and potential disaster follows. We all know the consequences of some of those. Powerful outreach. Open wisdom calls aloud. And here we start talking about the relationship between the word wisdom and, in the Hebrew text, feminine personification. Wisdom will be described with the pronoun she, perhaps in part because the Hebrew word for wisdom is a feminine noun. More importantly, wisdom personification as a woman may also reflect the fact that students at this time were all young men. By contrast, folly is portrayed as a loose woman who tempts men to their ruin. Contrasting to that, we have in the scripture, out in the open, wisdom calls aloud. She raises her voice in the public square. She speaks from the fence posts. She speaks from the tops of the wall, emphasizing she is calling as many people as possible to follow her in the ways of the Lord, rejecting foolish paths. The city's gates are where business is often conducted in ancient times. That's where she is. That's where wisdom is. In the public square, she is out in the public square. The square appears to describe any location that is busy with lots of people moving about. And so we see the relationship between the female wisdom and the extension of this proverb, using this to portray the feminine aspect of positive thinking. In this image, where you see the sins of not responding to wisdom's call, exactly what do you think about that? Well, the image of someone standing in a public place proclaiming a message boldly is nothing new. And after the last couple of weeks, we've seen that intensely on TV. What does wisdom call you to proclaim? What are you supposed to do in these issues? Wisdom's invitation. They are challenged to embrace knowledge. So what is knowledge here? Knowledge is a collection of information over the years of our experience, both formally and informally, as we go through life. The waywardness of turning away from wisdom is fatal. We cannot do that. The combination of kill and destroy conveys in this scripture passage the great violence that awaits those who reject this call to speak in a public place. In concluding, I would like to quote Paul. What happened to Solomon is most destructive. We'll look at him, and then we'll talk about Paul's last warning. What we think is Solomon was taken aside by some of his 700 wives and started worshiping other gods. Poor fellow. What we would like to say to Solomon here, not Paul, Solomon. What we would like to say to Solomon is, physician, heal yourself. But Solomon didn't see that. And he was told by the Lord that after he is passed, the Israelite community will be split in two. And to end this conversation, we think about all the things that Solomon did, all of the proverbs he put in writing, both by himself and his colleagues writing these. Great attributes. If you have a chance, look at the book of Proverbs, especially to the end chapter. Those are interesting reading. From this, we should view Solomon with compassion, not criticism. Anyone's spiritual failures, whether we read about them in the Bible or see them in the media, should humble us. Paul's warning that he put out to the people of Corinthians contains its own words of wisdom. And I quote, "If you think you are standing on firm ground, be careful that you don't fall." Thank you very much.